Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mark DiCarlo. Tonight, my guest is Professor Jim Klein, Professor of History at Del Mar College, correct?
Right.
And also a member or a founding father of a group called Drinking Liberally. What is Drinking Liberally? The title, Young Bohemians Drinking. I'm just joking.
This was started, I guess, 12 or 13 years ago. Two guys were sitting in a bar up in New York City talking about politics, and they said, we should really start an organization like this. And so they did, and it spread out beyond there, and now there are chapters in every state of the Union, I think outside of the U.S. as well. I think there are about 17 or 18 chapters in Texas, one here in Corpus Christi. So my wife and I started the Corpus Christi chapter about, I guess maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And we're the hosts for it for a while, and then we gave that up, I guess, about a year ago, 2 years ago. Joy Miller-Cavada is the host now.
Where does Drinking Liberally meet?
Yeah, it meets at the Center for Progressive Studies and Culture here in Corpus Christi, and that's at 413 Waco Street up by La Pond, right across La Pond, actually, from the county jail. Meets the third Thursday of the month at 7 o'clock. There's no agenda. Just stop by for chat, for talk, conversation. We talk about politics sometimes. Sometimes we talk about gardening. One night we got into a lengthy discussion about Aztec Indian culture. And so it just kind of depends on where the conversation takes us. Stop by. You can drink alcoholic beverages if you wish, obviously in moderation, or non-alcoholic beverages if you want as well. We've had folks come by who are in their 80s. We've had folks come by who are 4 or 5 years old as well.
Are they drinking?
Yeah,
4 and 5 years old?
Punch,
I'm just joking.
Something like that, yeah.
I'm just kidding. What'd you say about the Aztec Indians? Did they engage in human sacrifice?
There seems to be a lot of evidence to support that, yeah. And I think that's part of the reason that the Spaniards were successful against them. The common perception, I think, is that the Spaniards defeated the Aztec Indians, and there's a certain amount of truth to that. But Cortez and his men, he had a lot of supporters from other Native Americans who didn't like the Aztecs because they've been. This is a very new empire when Cortez conquers them, in 1520 and 21. It's less than a century old at that point yet, and they had been fairly brutal in ruling the area, central part of what's now Mexico, and kind of reaching out from there to the north and west, especially to the south, and then to the east as well, over toward the Gulf. And so Cortez has maybe a few hundred, close to 1,000, I guess, conquistadors with him. These are professional, trained fighting men, so they are worth their weight. But he's fighting against, a city, Tenochtitlan had more than 100,000, 200,000 residents in it. And he's able to defeat them partially, I think, because he's got several thousand Native Americans joining along with him. And it's because of that practice of
the brutality. Amongst the what you could say progressive or liberals, there's a little bit of I think of an idealization of indigenous peoples. But if you read the history of what was it, Chaka in Africa, was his name Chaka, the king? The brutality in Africa amongst some of these tribal people and indigenous peoples. And it's oftentimes, again, it's romanticized. Oh, these people were simple people, etc. Well, it's not all. There is a lot of brutality.
That's a constant struggle that we have in the study of history and the teaching of history as well. There's always a strong temptation to kind of make it into a morality play, and once you do that, make it into good guys versus bad guys, you really do a disservice because it's far more complicated than that. There are good people who do bad things, and there are bad people who do good things.
When you said that, what it made me think of is that biography on LBJ that by Morrow, I think his name was. There was 3 series.
Right.
And
Carroll.
Carroll, C-A-R-O, right? Mm-hmm. And I read the first book, and I said, boy, this LBJ, boy, he's a pretty bad guy, right? But then apparently during his, then I haven't gotten to the second book, I guess. He did provide electricity to these very poor people in the hill country, and running water, I think both, right?
That's right.
So he did a fair amount of good, even though he was somewhat
Yeah, he also signed
immoral. Fixed elections, fair to the married,
Yeah, not to defend LBJ, because there was a lot of questionable things that were done.
Well, the Vietnam War was very questionable.
But some of his actions, I think, political tactics, I think, are really a byproduct of Texas politics generally. That's the way things are done. So there's a lot of talk about dead people voting and stuffed ballot boxes out in Duval County. Well, the same thing was happening up in East Texas, and that not necessarily by the Johnson campaign, but by others as well.
Well, the Caro book seemed to think, Pathway to Power, I think it was, indicated that Johnson originated a lot of that. And that he originated a lot of the again, he started fixing campaigns in college, and that his father was a very poor politician, Lyndon Johnson's. Right. And he swore, I will never, Johnson allegedly swore or made the statements that I'm never going to be poor in politics again. I'm not going to be poor like my father was, and he wasn't.
Yeah, but corruption in politics in Texas predates Lyndon Johnson. I mean, it's down here in South Texas. I mean, the Parr family, R.G. Parr was the originator of the Parr dynasty over in Duval County. He comes into power, becomes a state senator in the 19-teens. And really kind of controls that section of the state. James Wells, is a judge down in the valley, and for whom Jim Wells County is named. He controlled the valley for a number of years. He was the political boss down there. And there's a guy here in Nueces County, Walter Timon, who kind of ran things here in Nueces County in the 19-teens into the first part of the 1920s.
Was George Parr assassinated?
No, I don't believe so.
I don't know. I thought. No.
There are some, and I don't have a lot of information about this. There is some suspicious.
Okay, so maybe I read some sort of suspicious story or something that
the wife of George Parr killed herself in the 1970s, I believe, and that was shortly after a very messy divorce and split between she and George, and that's about the time that he kind of fell from power over in Duval as well.
So. It's interesting that you stated that corruption is fairly common here, and I think that we had a brief telephone conversation when I asked you to come on about that issue, and I may have said something that I think it's endemic everywhere.
Yeah.
But I think that you indicated that you thought that it was stronger here than in many places.
I think so. My wife and I moved all over the country. We're in academia, and so until we landed the job here at Del Mar in Corpus Christi, we moved around periodically. So we lived in Georgia, lived in Atlanta, or just outside of Atlanta, Georgia, for a few years. I was doing a postdoc over there. We were in graduate school up in Oklahoma. My wife did an internship up at Purdue University in Indiana. Before all that, we lived in Wisconsin. So we were two farm kids from Iowa originally. So we kind of lived all over the place. And I would agree that politics is all about power, and power, the saying goes, corrupts. And so there's going to be a certain amount of corruption in politics anywhere. But I see much more of it down here, I think, than what I've seen elsewhere.
Well, recently some of us have been greatly concerned about what I joke about calling it the Corpus Christi apocalypse, wherein we have a number of questionable, and the paper says demolition, as if they're proud of it. The demolition of the two of the three boats of the Columbus fleet, the proposed demolition of Christus Spahn Memorial Hospital, the demolition of the Staple Street station, which is just 12 years old, RTA station, the demolition of the I can't remember the name of that movie theater. The movie theater on Leopard, the Morrow Theater.
Yeah.
And it seems like it's all demolitions which are of questionable validity or use. And some of the buildings are new. Some that we've been lied to about how Christus Spahn Memorial, how old it is. Christus Spahn Shoreline would actually seem to be older. Right. Christus Spahn Memorial would actually seem to be better located, more centrally located. Christus Spahn Memorial is not on the bay for evacuation purposes, for hurricane purposes, and the choice would seem to be clear that between the two hospitals, Christus Spahn Memorial should exist, and Christus Spahn Shoreline maybe should be torn down.
You can make a good argument for that. I mean, thinking about Memorial serves not just the west side, the north side of Corpus Christi, but also all those communities out to the west of us, Robstown and Banquete and Benavides and Driscoll and Bishop. Folks are brought in typically to Memorial from out there, and because it is situated so close to the Crosstown Expressway, it's a very fast trip.
Absolutely.
If they do away with Memorial, as they're talking about, and transition everything here to Shoreline, that's going to be a much longer trip because you're going to be on surface roads so much longer.
And they're making this argument that, it's not going to cost the taxpayers anything to move all these facilities to Christus Pond Shoreline. Well, as you know, where we're talking right now is basically right where Christus Pond Shoreline is.
Right.
I drive from the south side every day. There's no good way to get here.
Right.
There's no good way to get here because we're not close, as you say, to a major expressway. Now they're saying, well, and a lot of this is hidden. I actually did an open records request to see what streets they want to close, and it looks like they want to close Elizabeth Street. I'm a property owner. I'm not happy about that, which implies additional destruction at the Christus Pond Shoreline. But there's a proposal on the bond package that's coming up, $6.1 million to improve Morgan Street. Now, I think the implication is that it needs to be improved just to get people from Christus Pond, and I think they've said this, to get people from Crosstown to Christus Pond Shoreline, right down Morgan Street.
That's possible. That certainly is possible. I mean, it's hard for me to argue against a street improvement bond because on the one hand, I mean, the streets are in bad shape.
I'd argued against them. I mean,
you could argue that they should have been, that the repair should have been done without the bond being floated.
Well, what has been going on all these years?
Right.
Where's the money been going? I mean, obviously, we just and this was kind of interesting. I haven't heard anybody intelligently discuss it. Corpus Christi, they just passed this, or Nueces County, they just passed this tax on every business and every homeowner. They call it a street maintenance fee.
Right.
Well, when I try to research it, maintenance fee, I don't know what they're going to maintain. It's not like it's a car. You change the oil and the filters.
Right.
They're going to maintain the streets, but they're not going to improve the streets.
Right.
What are you going to maintain? I don't. They say they're not going to fix the streets. They're not going to improve the streets. They're going to maintain the streets. I don't know what that is supposed to mean.
Yeah,
and that was a lot of money.
Yeah,
for everybody.
That should be one of the first things that city government, county government does, is not just build but then also maintain the roads, this transportation network. And you're right, the fact that we haven't been doing that for the last 10 years, the last 20 years, maybe the last 25 years perhaps now, is a travesty. That's part of the reason that we're in the fix that we're in right now is because all that maintenance has been deferred.
Well, I can tell you anecdotally, I ran for city council about 15 years ago, and I ran on improving the streets and against all these big capital improvements and for basic services. The only thing that came out of that was for a couple terms, I heard these politicians, which apparently that refrain had some impact on the community, and I heard them for running for the next 2 terms. Yes, we need to get on basic services. But they didn't do it.
Right.
They just said it. I learned a lot about politics by that election because what I found is they don't. I don't think these politicians, a lot of them, believe anything. They just say what works.
Yeah.
And they don't even necessarily seem to want to execute on it. But those are the catchphrases.
Right.
There's a certain number of, and now people are more sophisticated. Bullet points.
Right.
I guess they call them bullet points. Those are the catchphrases for the day.
And then that's a dangerous trend. It's not just locally, but that's nationwide as well. But it's still a dangerous trend because quite often the things that need to be talked about most in depth cannot be boiled down into a bullet point. And so the problem then is that either difficult problems are being glossed over, they're being misrepresented in order to kind of shorten them into that bullet point, or they're not being talked about at all and they talk about something else that can be discussed in just a sentence fragment. And as I said, there are serious discussions that we need to be having, the local, the county, the state, the national level, that in many ways we're not really having.
Let's talk about something locally that impacts us a great deal, and I don't know that some of this, again, this is kind of as I say, a contemporaneous, extemporaneous show. You really don't know the issues. We hear all this about immigration, and how it impacts us, and we need to close the border. We hear that refrain from the right. We need to close the borders. As I said in the previous show where Mr. Wesley Reed was, I mean, the borders are closed. They're not allowed to come here. Now, if they're not being policed
Right.
adequately for the people coming over, or the people coming over aren't punished adequately so they still come, that's another issue.
Right.
How do you see historically, are you aware or have you studied the immigration patterns coming in from Mexico? Is it worse now than it was 5 years ago? Are the young children coming over, are they truly just coming over by themselves? Are there cartels involved? Do you have any kind of a historical perspective if the problem's gotten worse?
I have some historical perspective. The problem is that most of my research is in the very first part of the 20th century. So there's like a gap. So I have some knowledge of immigration patterns in South Texas.
So what years are you referring to?
Really 1900 to about 1930 or so.
Okay, so from 1900 to 1930, you're pretty astute on the issues of legal and illegal immigration?
Right, so I've done at least some research into that, but as I said, I kind of drop it then by 1930, I just haven't had a chance to get much beyond that, and so there's a gap from 1930 until you get up to about 2000 or 20.
So, many of the Mexican Americans that I know here, was shocking when I first came because so many of them have been here for generations, generation upon generation, where in a lot of the, for example, Mediterranean peoples came over during that period you're talking about, 1900. So, were there illegal immigrants in 1900 and 1930?
Yes. The immigration from Mexico started to pick up dramatically in the first decade of the 20th century when they began sinking wells, water wells, here in South Texas. Because before 1900, there's virtually no agriculture down here.
There's no water.
There's no water. And so there's some ranches, some large-scale ranches, but that was not as labor-intensive. And so, the King Ranch, for instance, did bring immigrants in from Mexico, the Queñeños, I think that they called them, in the last part of the 19th century
King's
already.
people, I heard they called them.
Right. And so that did happen, but very small numbers. The numbers start to grow dramatically after 1900 because as Nueces County gets opened to farming, crop farming, down in the valley, Hidalgo and Cameron County, and there's other smaller counties that are kind of carved out of those as well. All those are opened up. Now there's a greater demand now for labor, and so more and more of that starts to come across the border from Mexico. And in the border, while it was technically closed, it was still fairly porous yet as well. Because it's just a river and you have people historically...
The Texas border to Mexico is huge. I don't know how long it is, but I mean, just look at a map, it's enormous.
Right. And people who live along the border, think about a community like in Laredo, for instance, who lived over there historically, in the past, I'm thinking about more than 30 or 40 years ago, never really thought much of it at all about going back and forth across the border. It's just what you did. It's like as if I were traveling, crossing the Nueces River from Nueces County into San Patricio County. You don't really think about it all that much. It happens all the time. And it's only been more recent history now, in the last part of the 20th century, there's been a greater effort now to try to I guess you call it secure the border, or to kind of restrict movement across the border.
As a matter of fact, as recently, they want a passport to go over to Mexico.
Yeah.
And that's a big cultural shift, even people who just moved here from Texas and whatever since the 80s or something, we thought one of the benefits of living here is, you could go across the border and you would go whatever, buy your medications, which I think they made that harder too.
Right.
Your prescription medications.
There's some folks who would go down to Progreso, for instance, just across the border for veterinary medicine also, not just human, but also veterinary medicine, and dental work sometimes also.
Yes, many people go down there for dental work, and all that is being heavily discouraged, I think, now. I think sometimes they might ask you for a prescription, and again, you need a passport. A lot of people don't have passports.
Some of that as well, I think, has to do with the fact that the cartels, you mentioned a few minutes ago, have become more prominent now in those northern cities, those border towns in northern part of Mexico. And so it begs the question, well, can you still be safe going into some of these communities? 10 years ago, that's not much of a question. Now it is. It's an honest question. Maybe should you even be going into a small town like Progreso or a larger city like Reynosa or something like that? And so I think that's also discouraging people from the States anyway going into Mexico that maybe would have before.
We hear about you hear about cartels, and I think that's short for drug cartels, which I assume is some sort of, according to the what you see on television or in the mass media, some sort of organized drug crime transportation system, right?
Mhm.
How old are they? Have they been around forever? Are they new?
That's a good question.
I didn't hear
couldn't
of
tell you
them
that.
years ago.
Yeah, no, they may have existed, but you know, and then there's some parallels. You know, my research is in liquor prohibition, and so there's some parallels between drug laws today, now in the 21st century, and liquor laws. Liquor is really also a drug, a legal drug now. Liquor laws from the first part of the 20th century. When liquor prohibition comes in, it doesn't create organized crime. They existed before. The gangs existed before, but they're kind of small-time gangs. You know, Al Capone is a mobster before prohibition comes into play. Lucky Luciano up in New York City and so forth, were small-time gangsters. They ran the docks, they ran gambling operations, houses of prostitution, those sorts of things before liquor prohibition. When prohibition comes in, it provides a huge opportunity for them because now there's a commodity that suddenly is illegal that is still in very, very high demand. And that's one of the parallels that I see with the liquor or the drug laws now today, is that these cartels, drug cartels, may have existed before, but they're very small, tend to be much more localized, I suspect, and when they moved into the illicit drug traffic, they found themselves with a huge opportunity. They've been able to expand dramatically.
Well, let's discuss, obviously, marijuana has recently been legalized in Colorado, and allegedly, and it has been legalized in the state of Washington. I don't think they're quite as progressed in the dispensaries and haven't worked out all the legalities, et cetera. Have you followed that issue of prohibition as analogized maybe to marijuana usage, or whether or not crime would go down in the United States if, let's just take marijuana first. If marijuana would be legalized, is organized crime involved in marijuana?
I think so. I think so. And certainly the harder drugs, heroin and cocaine, that sort of thing as well. But I think also in marijuana, because it is an illicit drug. And so I think the cartels are involved in that sort of thing. And legalization then would essentially hurt their, at least current, business model.
Well, in Texas, some years ago, they used to have what's called setups. Was it some certain counties or something that you have to bring in your own liquor, right?
Right, that's right. They did the same thing up in Oklahoma as well, and some other states. They called it, I think, liquor by the drink, so that you could enter into a bar, call it a club, and you'd bring your own booze in sometimes,
right.
own alcohol, and they would sell you the setup then, the mix or whatever with
right.
booze. Or sometimes they would arrange it a bit differently, where they would declare themselves to be a club and say that you're a member, and so your bottle is on the shelf over here. Well, it turns out your bottle is being sampled by lots of other people as well, but they declare it to be your bottle, so that when you come in, then they're technically not selling you the alcohol; they're selling you maybe as a membership in the club.
Was that all over? That was all over Texas, or just in certain counties? I know it was in Harris County, Houston, like that.
Yeah, I think it was all over Texas. Although I should say that there were some dry counties as well that banned alcohol.
So the issue is, if you studied historically on the liquor in the liquor situation, if one county's dry
right.
and one county's not, does that cause? I would assume that's causing a lot of people to going to the county that's selling liquor, right?
That's right, and that's why you've got all the county line liquor stores. Wherever you got dry counties, you're going to have liquor stores ringing that dry county. That's true up in Arkansas, Oklahoma, now and elsewhere, and here in Texas as well. And that's a real problem, especially on the western side of Texas, where where the counties become so much larger, where they're not just 20 miles across, but 30, 40, 50, 60 miles across. And the issue is that if someone is going to drive now from the center of one dry county now out to the outskirts to the county line, 30, 35 miles to get their booze, are they going to drive all the way back home before they start consuming? Chances are pretty good no. So in that sense, then, the kind of patchwork of dry counties and wet counties tends to encourage drunken driving.
Well, so let's assume that that's not going to happen, I guess, with marijuana, because I don't think it's within a county's power to legalize marijuana.
Right. Right.
That's right. So that can't occur.
The state legislature would have to pass a law allowing for local option, which is what they did with alcohol, to allow the counties to say, do you want to legalize it or not? So when Prohibition ended in 1933, when liquor was legalized again, the state of Texas, which I think legalized alcohol again, allowed the counties, individual counties, to decide, do you want to remain dry or not? Several of them are still dry yet today.
I think maybe most states allow counties to be dry. Is that right? Will allow counties to be dry?
I know
in the state of Ohio, where I'm originally from, they have certain dry counties, and they have them here in Texas, right?
Yeah. And when I was growing up in Iowa, I don't know of any dry counties in the state of Iowa at the time. This is in the 70s and 80s.
Mm-hmm.
We lived in Wisconsin in the 90s. I don't recall any dry
Okay,
counties
so
there, but I'm not sure about that.
So have you followed since the legalization of marijuana in Colorado? I will tell you, I know of someone who went to Colorado. He said he likes Colorado, and it's beautiful in Colorado, but I do think that he wanted to check it out.
Yeah.
Check it out. And it would be interesting as a kind of a sociological deal to go up there and see, are people smoking on the street? See these stores, et cetera.
Well, and not just that, but I think now, because we had these two examples, Colorado and Washington, with different circumstances, but now we have these two different examples, and so going forward, it'd be good, very interesting. I'm hoping that somebody is doing this already, to measure the social consequences of legalization of marijuana. So those who have said that marijuana is a gateway drug to other drugs, so has there been an uptick then in consumption, not just of marijuana, but of other illicit drugs as a consequence? I'm not sure I buy into that argument myself. I think that the reason marijuana has been seen as a gateway drug is primarily because it's illegal. And that meant that the same person who sold you cocaine also sold you marijuana, or vice versa. And so once legalized now, I'm not sure that it's also that it can still be seen as a gateway drug, but we're going to find that out. Maybe perhaps cocaine consumption will spike in Colorado.
I know there's I'm not that much on logic, but I know that I would venture to guess that 90% of the drug addicts, though, did start with marijuana. And that's what I would guess. Having said that, probably the largest percentage of marijuana users never progress to harder drugs, or at least a problem with harder drugs.
Right. It'd be interesting to kind of look at that. Those hard drug users, cocaine, heroin, that sort of thing. How many of them started out as marijuana users? How many of them started out as alcohol users? I think the percentage would be quite high there as well.
The one religion that seems to say, look, you can't do any of that stuff, it's a sin, is the Baptists. Mm-hmm. And I kind of see the logic in it. If you never take that first drink, you never will be an alcoholic.
Right.
So that's a strong argument. Now, I don't know that in let's say, Catholicism, drinking is more acceptable.
Well, some of this has to do with
culturally,
the difference in theology, because by the middle of the 19th century, the Baptist Church and the Methodist churches both had abandoned use of wine or alcoholic drinks in their religious services. They'd switched to fruit juice. Whereas the Catholic Church, still into the 21st century, at Lutheran Church as well, Jewish faiths also still use wine in the service.
Do you know the rationale? Excuse me for interrupting you. But what's the rationale that those two Protestant denominations felt that they could get away from wine when it's obviously I can't read I don't read the New Testament in ancient Greek and Hebrew and whatever. I can't read it, but it's wine.
Yeah, that's
and it's wine, and it's a metaphysical. It has a lot of metaphysical meaning. It's a transformation, which is indicating the coming of Christ. Mm-hmm. The water turns into wine, and the richness of that. So I just wondered. I guess one of these days maybe we could have a minister or preacher on to discuss that.
That'd be a good conversation to have. That goes back to the story of the miracle at Cana from out of the New Testament, when Jesus is supposed to have turned water into wine at a wedding reception.
And I believe that has to do with the relationship between men and women. Mm-hmm. That has to do with the relationship between Christ's first miracle was indicating his own his own coming, and that the water turned into wine is his presence. So that's a remarkable story, of course. So we don't know at this point regarding historically. You've studied prohibition, but we don't really know about the prohibition of marijuana, where it's going to wind up. Have you analogized? Have you looked at all about marijuana use in young people in the States? And
I have not all that much. You mean to
well,
make
there's
a
prohibition
comparison with alcohol again, or something?
Yes, like well, I guess there's prohibition. There's prohibition for alcohol now for kids under 21.
Right.
Right? Was it that way before? Were young people always forbidden from drinking in the earliest stages? Are you aware of that, or that's not?
Yeah. So it was always 21 in the 19th century, but there's no documentation. You needed to have an ID or anything with you when you went into the saloon, and so typically these laws are enforced very unevenly, informally. Maybe is the best way of saying it. So meaning that if you could walk into a saloon and convince the bartender that you were of age, that you were an adult, then the bartender might very well serve you. And perhaps there were saloons that served people under the age of 21, far under the age of 21, and sometimes they got in trouble with the local community for that as well, that they shouldn't be doing that. And so we know that did happen. So 21 seems to have been kind of the age of adulthood. Then in the middle of the last part of the 20th century, those drinking ages come down. And some of this, I think, is kind of a reaction on a bit shakier, thinner ground here, thinner ice here. But as some of this has to do with America's involvement in Vietnam in the 1960s, and the fact that people are being drafted at age 18. That's why
old enough to fight, old enough to vote.
Well,
so then they said, okay, reduce the vote.
Right.
Then it's an analogous argument, right?
Right.
Old enough to fight, old enough to vote, old enough to drink.
That's right. And the argument was, that's right. If I'm sufficiently responsible to go out and be killed for my country or to kill somebody else in the name of my country, why is it that I'm not sufficiently responsible enough to be able to drink alcohol? And so that brought those drinking ages down. They did vary from state to state. In Iowa, when I was growing up in the 70s, the drinking age was 19. In Wisconsin, I think it was 18. In South Dakota, nearby, where I grew up, it was 18 up there as well. I think in Illinois, it was either 20 or 21. And then about 1985 or 1986 or so, there was, Mothers Against Drunk Driving became a powerful organization, a very influential lobbying group. And the Reagan administration essentially said, look, the drinking age is a state issue. So you can set your drinking age at whatever you want. However, if you don't put it at 21, the state, will no longer get any federal funds for highways. And so all the states said, right, it's 21. It's our choice. We choose to make it 21. And that's when it became standardized at 21 again.
Well, is a lot of this like have you studied, like, there could be like a backward prohibition, Mothered Against Drunk Driving. Well, you could drink, but you can't drive back and forth to a bar and have more than 3 or more drinks without taking a chance on picking up a DWI and at a great cost and expense. And then the backward prohibition, well, we'll raise the age. And then that's what seems to often occur. And then they could do that through taxation, right? Also. Right.
And see, that's the thing is for those counties that choose to, even today, to prohibit sale of alcohol, they do lose out on some revenue, tax revenue from those alcohol sales. And that's one of the big arguments in the midst of the prohibition debate in the 19-teens leading up to national prohibition. One of the arguments against it is that it was going to seriously reduce the tax revenues coming into the national government, into the state and local governments for that matter as well.
Regarding that, some of the, I don't want to say activists, African American or black activists, swear that there are more liquor stores placed in poverty areas. And there is some indication, then there's some corruption in talking about drugs, whether or not, there was a big scandal about that crack being brought in, was it by the CIA in southern LA, right?
Yeah,
remember that?
Yeah, I know, just heard a little bit
tangentially
about that.
Yeah, well, that's supposedly historically true. So when you're studying about prohibition, could there be any implications or anything that these drugs or liquor are being marketed to the poor?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know about marketed. What I found, and I don't want to get too far off in the weeds here in a historical argument, but we historians kind of have these conversations, these arguments back and forth, and each historical topic has its own kind of historiography, study of how this has changed over time, how the examination has changed over time. And in liquor prohibition, comes in the 20s, leaves in the 30s, and some of the earliest explanations for liquor prohibition was that it was rural America, rural dry America, pitted against wet urban America, and that this was the last great victory for rural dry America as urban America is rising, surpassing it. Since then, people have looked at it a bit more differently, and so as we move into the 1960s, especially 1970s, historians looking back at prohibition argued it's much more of a religious issue. So you get the Baptists and the Methodists over here, you get the Catholics and the Lutherans over here, the Jewish population over here, and that is primarily a religious issue. There are a few others, and this is where I would put myself as well, who argue that liquor prohibition, the debate over liquor prohibition, was actually an economic class issue. Because when I was doing my research up in Oklahoma, what I found up there is that the Catholic population up there is very, very small. Very small. And Oklahoma does vote itself dry, but narrowly. It's like 51.5% vote in favor of prohibition and 48.5% vote against it. And so based on the size of the Catholic population up there, the wet vote should have been minuscule, 10%, 15% at the very most. And the other argument has been that those who oppose prohibition tend to be immigrants from other countries. Well, the immigrant population in Oklahoma was very, very tiny as well. And so neither one of those two arguments explain what happens in Oklahoma. And what they do have, representing that huge wet minority vote, is a big working class population. The oil fields have been opened by 1900, 1901 in Tulsa, and later on in Oklahoma City, but in Tulsa already, and in the Cushing oil fields in the 19-teens. The mining industry is very active up there. Coal mines in the southeastern part of the state, and zinc mines up in the northeastern part of the state. And it's in those communities where the authorities have the most difficult time trying to enforce prohibition, which tells me, as I said, that it's primarily an economic class issue. So I wouldn't say that with liquor prohibition that they're marketing to the working class or the sub-working class, but that population tends to be more
I'm sorry.
socialized to drinking, I guess.
Isn't that the argument that against marijuana, crack, etc., that marijuana was a kind of a discrimination against those who first used it, which was supposedly Mexican Americans, and that the heavy penalties for the use of crack cocaine was in fact directed against American blacks, and so isn't that a common thread that the certain of these prohibitions are oriented to criminalize the behavior of certain minority groups or lower socioeconomic groups?
Yeah, I think it certainly is true with liquor prohibition that it's not enforced evenly, and the people of color, the African American population here in South Texas, the Hispanic population, they understand that intimately. It's not going to be enforced evenly, which means that if I'm an African American person, I'm more likely to get arrested for violating liquor laws. And that's why, for the most part, they vote against prohibition. And I think you could make the same argument along economic class lines as well, because we know, there's a lot of talk here in Corpus Christi in the 19-teens, Corpus Christi votes itself dry in 1916. The nation goes dry in 1920. Corpus Christi, Nueces County goes dry in 1916. And so in the last part of the teens, into the 20s, during the World War I years here, there are regular newspaper articles about liquor raids, but most of those tend to take place on what they call the Hill, which is where the Mexican American population live, up on the bluff, Leopard Street area and that region there. And very little of it downtown. This is before the 1919 storm. The Anglo population tended to live down below the bluff. Very few raids down there. Some of the very nice establishments, eating establishments, perhaps drinking establishments, or clubs right on the waterfront, on Water Street, which is the shoreline at the time, were left alone. And the newspaper people are recognizing this, that there is this uneven enforcement, that in a sense kind of these small-time dealers, liquor dealers, up on the Hill as they call it, are being targeted by the law enforcement officials, while at the same time some of the larger liquor distributors, wealthier, more prosperous liquor distributors, are being left alone.
Well, the real question nobody asks is, and maybe you could answer this, when there's prohibition in a county or a state or nationally, number one, do less people drink, and number two, are less people alcoholics?
Yeah, that's. I can provide an educated guess. Because we don't really know.
I will tell you, I have read that there were less alcoholics during the period of Prohibition. Is that true? I don't know.
I don't think so. No, I don't think so. The problem, though, is that until Prohibition comes in 1920, you can measure the amount of alcohol being consumed. All you got to do is just check the liquor sales. And that's easy to do because you got the liquor tax, so the IRS is keeping track of all this, and so they can keep the numbers. As soon as liquor becomes illegal now on January 16th of 1920, now suddenly everything's off the books. And so how do you compare 1919 to 1920? This is virtually impossible to do. But and a lot of historians argued initially that liquor prohibition did work in the first few years of the 20s, and then gradually it became...
Well, that would make sense.
Is violated. I would argue against that as well. It seems to me that liquor prohibition did work from the very beginning. There are fewer arrests for liquor violations in 1920 and 21 than there are in 25 and 26. But that's because a lot of people on January 15th of 1920, the day before everybody went dry, stockpiled alcohol. There's a fraternity up at Yale University. They did a study, and they estimated how much alcohol do we as a fraternity, as a frat house, how much alcohol do we consume in a single year? And they purchased 15 times that, right before liquor prohibition comes in. So they could drink legally, because they purchased it legally before January 16th of 1920. And lots of other people did the same thing, but they didn't have as much money as the Yaleys did. They didn't have as much money as those frat guys did, and so they didn't purchase 15 years worth. They purchased maybe 15 months worth, more than likely, realistic, maybe 15 weeks worth. So for the first part of 1920 to 21, there is less demand for alcohol because people have already got enough. But by 1920, you get the end of 1920 to 21 into 22 now, more and more people have run through their stock and their supply, and so there's greater demand for alcohol, and there are businessmen, mostly men, some women as well, moving in to meet that demand. Those are the bootleggers. And so you start to see an uptick in liquor arrests as a consequence of that. But I don't think, if looking at alcohol consumption alone, that you see much of a drop-off. And we know that as well because there are a lot of newspaper articles about, sometimes they're mysterious deaths, sometimes they're very upfront about this. There's a real problem with bathtub gin. People tried making their own. And
certain number of deaths as a result.
That's right. I'm not a chemist, but if you don't distill alcohol at the proper temperature, you create a poison. So if you don't know what you're doing, it can be really dangerous. And so there's
moonshine, people went blind. That's what they used to say. Moonshine, people went blind. There was that movie Thunder Road with Robert Mitchum that documented that very popularly in the 50s, etc. And people were going blind from moonshine.
And so that's happening already in 1920 and 21, not just in 25 and 26.
Was there an exception for religious services if you wanted to use wine?
Yeah,
do you know?
Yeah, there was. In fact, that went to the courts up in Oklahoma. They tried to ban religious sacramental wine in Oklahoma because the Catholic Church was so small. The Catholic Church took them to court and won. And so there was an exemption for religious, for sacramental wine. But there's going to be some abuse of that as well. The amount of sacramental wine being ordered increased by like 10 to 15 fold when liquor prohibition comes in.
Well, certainly. even like if you're Catholic, you hear tales of the altar boys partaking, whatever. You know, something you said made me think of a more contemporary issue, which you said about, in Corpus Christi, where the Anglos would live, and in various, limitations of drinking in certain areas. We got an issue here that I think is kind of interesting, the windmill issue. Yeah. This company wants to build a windmill farm on the south side, and the city of Corpus Christi is saying, well, you can't build that windmill because it's going to stop south side growth.
Right.
I was of the opinion on the side of free enterprise myself that they should allow them to build it, and in fact this south side growth is harmful to the city, has caused urban sprawl, and that is primarily benefiting developers, title insurance companies, et cetera, to the detriment of the city and the city taxpayers. Have you followed that windmill issue? Because you're involved in
That's
politics
right.
to a certain extent.
Oh, yeah. And in fact, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm the past chair of the Clean Economy Coalition, which organized here about 5 years ago.
So you're very familiar. You may have even supported windmill use.
Oh, yeah, very much so. We were trying to court groups like that to come into the area here. And so when the city council made that statement that we didn't want them here because it's going to stop Southside growth in that area, I was appalled on a number of different levels. First of all, because that's a source of energy that's not going to cause nearly so much pollution as other sources would, like this failed Las Brisas plant that is finally now gone away. And so it would have been good for the economy without harming the health of the community, the environmental or human health of the community. Secondly, as you said, the argument that this is going to stop potential growth on the south side that's not such a bad thing. We do have a problem with sprawl. The issue, though, is that when people think of urban sprawl, they think it's an environmental issue. It is, I suppose, but it's also an economic issue because it costs money to push water. It costs money to push fresh water, to push wastewater, to push squad cars, to push fire trucks. If we go out to the south side out there, as they're proposing, we're going to have to build another wastewater treatment plant. And so all that infrastructure, part of the reason, not entirely, but part of the reason that roads in Corpus Christi are in the shape they're in is because our population has been virtually flat for the last 30 years. A little bit of growth, but not very much. Yet geographically, Corpus Christi has doubled, virtually doubled. It's grown expansively out of Calallen on the south side and out on the island. None of that was there 30 years ago, or very little. And so, it costs so much more to push the water that much further. And so we have all these additional standard costs, standard expenses.
Much bigger infrastructure, et cetera, roads.
And so if we go out there, as the city council wants us to, that's only going to compound the problem. It's not going to solve it. It's going to help, you're right, it's going to help the developers. And this is a problem that I've had for a number of years now, that our city council is not representative of Corpus Christi.
No, and I must say that I personally felt that the city council was much better when there were more attorneys on it. Now we have so many of these people hawking this title insurance,
right,
which I've said on the show several times, and I think it's a scandal.
Well,
you buy title insurance on a piece of property. You're paying a lot of money for something that's almost worthless.
Right.
You're not getting anything for that money because you try to sue on that title insurance once, and you see what you get, and you see how firm the defenses are. Well, you know what you get? Usually diminished value of the property, maybe, which they'll bring in an expert unless that hasn't diminished at all, the insurance company. So I think it's a danger when you have people just in real estate and title companies, et cetera, serving on city council.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say that they shouldn't serve on city council. I just think the problem we got now is that there's an overrepresentation of title and real estate industry folks on the city council. My dad was a real estate agent, and so those tend to be kind of the town boosters, and so they should have a role to play in the management of government.
Certainly.
But the fact that there are so many people from that industry, you're right. And so when the general public looks at an issue, let's say the wind farm on the south side, or maybe perhaps Memorial Hospital, they think they can see different sides, multifaceted sides to the issue, but the public officials don't.
They shouldn't have built the Spawn Hospital on the south side if there were enough hospitals already.
Right.
If that's what they're doing, I don't know. I don't know who knows about the complexities of this and how far back it goes. Talking about the windmills, I got to ask you this question since you seem so up on it. I had read that the actual atmosphere will change because the wind is going through those windmills.
I don't know about that.
You never read about that? And then I understand there's some danger to birds.
There's some danger to birds. That's been overstated, I think, because the first studies about bird strikes with windmills it took place back in California in the 1970s. And the windmills that were built in California in the 70s, the windmill itself was set up on a big, tripod, much like the cameras are sitting on here. Or like you'd see like an old 19th century windmill would be set up on a big tripod like that. And so the birds would build their nests in the scaffolding stand of the tripod. Well, the windmills that we've got now that are being put up now are on a single post. And so there's nothing to draw the birds in. So there are some, certainly, I don't doubt, that get hit by the windmills. But, think about this up in San Patricio County. We've had that huge wind farm up there now for, 3 years, 4 years? I don't
Yeah,
hear big reports about massive
No,
bird
and a
fallouts.
friend of mine has a farm, and he doesn't say I find a bunch of dead birds around it or anything like that. And I think birds are pretty intelligent too.
Yeah.
I think they learn pretty quickly.
You know, I mean, birds run into buildings too. They run into cars.
Well, yeah,
There's
they'll run
also
into the
as
glass
well.
quite often. You know, since we're talking about energy and clean energy, what do you think about nuclear power? Have you studied that issue? Have you, since you're president of the Clean Energy Coalition, is nuclear power clean energy? What did you think about the Japanese tragedy and the implications of nuclear power?
I've always had some reservations about it, about nuclear energy, because there's always the danger of, you know, what if something goes wrong? And Fukushima, I think, really brought that front and center. There are some folks, and I don't know if I would count myself amongst them, but there are some good friends of mine who argue that nuclear can be clean energy, and that if we want to move or expand the nuclear energy sector in America, we should be following the French model rather than the Japanese model. The Japanese built massive nuclear plants, and so when you got a problem at the plants, you got a massive problem, whereas the French built numerous smaller nuclear plants instead, and they don't seem to have had the same difficulty there. You know, they're not on the same fault line as Japan as well, and so that might be an issue over there also. There is a problem, you know, the ongoing problem, you know, what do you do with the waste?
That has been that's one of the major problems. But from what I can tell, that's not the problem. The problem is the safety of the plants.
Right.
If you look at a culture like Japan, so great at miniaturization and engineering, from the Sony cameras you see here, etc., you're thinking, if they can't do it,
Right.
who can? And I do think that industry, I can't, this is just a concept, because I worked in some industries. It's rough.
Right.
The guys in industry are rough. Whether it's a steel mill or whatever, to say that you're going to be able to run something, which apparently the size and scope of that, within that kind of precision, so an
Right.
accident doesn't happen,
Right.
at this point, it wouldn't seem to be possible
So,
or
you know,
probable.
accidents could happen in the wind farm as well.
But they're not catastrophic.
that's right. That's right.
So if one of those falls over,
Perhaps somebody gets hurt, maybe killed for that matter as well. But you're right; it's not going to be catastrophic for the entire community in the area.
does our area have not a wind farm, obviously we see windmills all over, but do we have nuclear plants? What's the closest one? Have we had any problems with it? I thought there was one that was closed or something.
There's one in San Antonio, I believe. That might be
Is that the nearest
closest.
one?
There's one up, I think, north of Victoria yet as well. Maybe about the same distance, I guess, as the one in San Antonio.
Have we had any problems, or?
Not that I know of. San Antonio was talking about building a second one, and then I think really Fukushima froze all that. Up until this point now, all that talk has stopped up there.
You're president of the Clean Energy Coalition. Do you know, or have you ever, when you were in that role, did you ever? Doesn't it seem like our energy costs, our electricity costs, are higher here than other comparable areas, or is that not true?
In some ways, I suppose, there are companies out there that you can get a very good deal with, though. My wife and I have we have our own house energy contract with a company out of San Antonio, and our rates tend to be very, very low. They offer us wind energy as well as an alternative, that 100% of our energy is coming from wind generation. And so they kind of partner with some of the wind farms here to provide that for them. But our costs tend to be low. Right now, I think they've risen a bit now up to maybe about 10 cents a kilowatt hour. But they've been down as low as 5 for quite a while. 5.5 maybe cents per kilowatt hour.
You know, I think we're reaching the end of our show pretty close. We've got a bunch of elections coming up, and I don't know that we want to talk too much about them. What is you work at Del Mar, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And they have stuff, I don't know, are you in a position to talk about whether or not you're a professor of history at Del Mar? Are you in a position to talk about whether or not you favor the voters voting for the bonds and for the Del Mar projects?
The administration at Del Mar hasn't told the faculty that they want us to, that we can't say anything. Del Mar has real needs. I think the last time we asked for a bond was in 2002, so it's been quite a while, 12 years now. But the timing, I think, is difficult because I think that there's a lot of angst in the community.
There's a lot of anger around all, I think there's a lot of angst regarding all the stuff being destroyed and then some of the tentative projects.
And CCISD is going to ask for a bond as well, and then the city's got the roads, the street user fee, they're going to ask for money now as well for all that. And so that piled on now with the Del Mar bond may do it in, I don't know. Del Mar's asking, I believe, for $157 million to conduct construction on the East Campus. There are a number of old buildings there that need to either be remodeled or torn down. On the West Campus, there's
more demolition. I'm just
right. You're right.
No repurposing. You know, I had posted on Facebook this picture of Bellevue Hospital in New York City, which has been repurposed for the homeless, et cetera. And it's maybe 2 to 3 times older than Spahn Memorial. Right. They don't talk about tearing it down.
Yeah, my wife and I just went through graduation this past, I guess, week and a half ago, yesterday, had Del Mar graduation for the summer, and they still sing or play the same processional song. We still wear the mortar boards yet. All those are traditions that come out of the Middle Ages.
I was unaware of that.
Yeah, and yet. You're right. The buildings now, as soon as the building gets to be more than 20 or 30 years old,
well, here,
you want to knock it down already.
Here, and again, I think it's primarily an issue for the developers and the contractors. I can't believe that the magnitude of destroying an entire hospital,
right,
and wherein you would think you need more medical care, not less, or there could be a repurposing, and none of this stuff was sold.
Right.
None of this stuff was put up for sale. None of it was repurposed. It's tear it down.
Right, and that's the thing is the public still needs to kind of learn more about this as well. I think because the longstanding residents understand this, know this better than I do, that Memorial Hospital is not owned by Spahn.
That's right. It's a county property.
That's right. That's right. It's public property.
And we remember when it was transferred to Spahn to take care of the indigent. Now they want to tear it down.
Right. So, strictly speaking, it's not Spahn's decision to tear that hospital down.
No, it has to have that approval of the county, and I think a lot of the county commissioners are maybe facing being voted out of office. Who knows, based upon their stand that many people think is a hospital that is needed for the indigent.
The county commissioners haven't said very much about this, and they should. I think they're waiting until after the election to come out and speak publicly about this, and they should not be doing that. That's a coward's way out. They should be coming out now and discussing this at the county commission meetings and taking a vote on this, whether we want to do this or not. Let the public weigh in then as well. I think it does a disservice to the general public to wait until after the elections and people are elected back into office or maybe elected newly to office, and then they decide to make a decision on this afterward. Because this is already in the works. Spahn's already been talking about this now. The general public's already aware of this. There have been public meetings about it. And the meetings that I've been to, nobody... I've been to 2 of these now up at O'Beal Williams Center, one sponsored by Spahn, one sponsored by the local chapter of the NAACP. Nobody from the general public's in favor of it.
Thank you. This has been Professor of History, Mr. Jim Klein. Second time on the show. Always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.
Good night.